He owned this hotel. Tonight, they wouldn't even let him check in one glance, one judgment. They had no idea who was standing in front of them. They asked him to prove he belonged in his own. Building 1 text message. 14 minutes. Everything was about to change. She didn't know his hoodie. She knew his name, and it changed everything. Rain hammered the glass doors of the Meridian Grand Hotel at 11 o'clock at night, and Daniel Brooks stood on the wrong side of them, holding his sleeping daughter's hand, being told by his own front desk staff that he did not look like the kind of man who could afford a room. If that sentence makes your blood boil, stay with me until the end, because what happened next is the reason this story is being watched by millions of people right now. And if it moves you even a dest, hit that like button and subscribe, because stories like this one deserve to be heard by everyone. Daniel hadn't planned to arrive looking like this. His flight had been delayed twice. His suit jacket was crumpled in his carry-on because he'd changed out of it somewhere over Ohio to be more comfortable for 6-year-old Mia, who was cranky and overtired, and clinging to a stuffed rabbit with one ear chewed soft from years of crank love. He was wearing a plain gray hoodie, jeans with a coffee stain on the knee, and sneakers that had seen better days. His beard was 3 days past a trim. He looked, by any measure, like an ordinary tired father, dragging a suitcase and a half-asleep child through an airport at midnight, because that is exactly what he was. What the two people behind the front desk did not know, could not have known, because he had never once let his face become famous the way some CEOs did, was that Daniel Brooks owned the Meridian Grand, not a franchise fee, not a management contract. He owned the building, the land beneath it, and 11 other hotels like it across the country, all built from nothing after the worst year of his life. He stepped up to the counter, with Mia leaning against his leg, half asleep on her feet, and gave his name and a confirmation number for the presidential suite he had booked himself, under a company alias he sometimes used to check on his properties without ceremony. The night clerk, a young man named Tyler, with gelled hair and a smirk he didn't bother hiding, tapped at his keyboard, glanced at Daniel's hoodie, glanced at the suitcase with a broken wheel, and said the reservation must have been a mistake, because that room wasn't the kind of room available to walk-ins. Daniel calmly explained there was no walk-in involved, that it was a confirmed reservation, and asked him to check again. Tyler exchanged a look with the woman beside him, an assistant manager named Denise, who stepped in with a tight, practiced smile that didn't express her eyes, and asked Daniel for a credit card, to see what he could actually afford, the emphasis landing like a slap. Mia stirred against her father's leg, and asked, in the small voice of a child who has been awake far too long, "Daddy, why is she being mean to us?" And that question did something to Daniel, that no boardroom failure, no bank rejection in his 20s, no midnight phone call about his wife's diagnosis years earlier had quite done. It didn't make him angry in the way people expect anger to look. It made him quiet. Still, the kind of quiet that comes from a man who has learned, through years of hard living, exactly which battles are worth his voice and which ones are worth his patience. He crouched down to Mia's height, right there in the middle of the lobby, and told her softly that grown-ups sometimes have bad nights just like kids do, and that it wasn't anything she had done wrong. It was a small lie of omission, the kind fathers tell to protect their children from an ugliness they aren't ready to carry. But even as he said it, he felt the old, familiar ache rise in his chest, the one that had lived there since he was 9 years old on a folding chair in a break room, watching his mother be spoken to as though she were furniture that occasionally needed cleaning itself. He had promised himself, decades ago, that his own child would never once feel that particular kind of smallness inside a building that bore his family's values on every wall. And here it was anyway, in his own lobby, under his own roof. Behind the desk, Tyler shifted his weight and glanced toward the security camera mounted well, discreetly above the concierge stand, the way people do when a small, uneasy part of them senses they might be making a mistake but have already committed too far to back down, gracefully. Denise, meanwhile, straightened the lapel of her blazer and repeated, almost by rote, that policy is policy, a phrase she would later admit, in a very different conversation. She had never actually questioned the meaning of, in 3 years of employment. Neither of them asked Daniel his full name. Neither of them asked why a man traveling alone with a young child at midnight might simply be tired rather than suspicious. They had already decided, somewhere in the first 10 seconds of the interaction, what kind of guest he was, and no amount of calm, reasonable explanation from him was going to undo a judgment that had been made before he'd guessed a single word. He handed over his card without a word. Denise ran it, frowned at the screen, as though disappointed it hadn't declined, and told him that unfortunately, the presidential suite had a system hold, and the best she could offer was a standard room on the 3rd floor, if he wanted it. Delivered with the weary condescension of someone doing a stranger a favor he hadn't earned. Daniel asked, still evenly, to speak with the general manager. Tyler laughed, an actual laugh, short and disbelieving, and said the general manager did not come in for walk-in complaints at midnight, and that if Daniel had a problem, he could call the number on the website in the morning. It would be easy to tell you that Daniel exploded here, slammed his fist on the counter, announced his name like a superhero unmasking, and watched the color drain from their faces. That is not what happened, and it is not the kind of man Daniel Brooks is. He picked Mia up, felt her arms wrap sleepily around his neck, and said only, "Thank you for your help tonight," in a voice so calm that Denise later admitted it unsettled her more than shouting would have. He walked to a quiet corner of the lobby, sat down in one of the velvet chairs his own design team had chosen 4 years earlier, and pulled out his phone. To understand why this moment cut so deep, you have to understand where Daniel Brooks came from. Because the story of the Meridian Grand did not begin with marble floors and chandeliers. It began in a 2-room apartment above a laundromat in a town most people have never heard of, where Daniel's mother worked double shifts as a hotel housekeeper for 22 years, and came home every night smelling of bleach and stripped sheets. Her hands cracked from industrial cleaners, her back permanently bent from making beds that were never hers to sleep in. Daniel remembered being 7 years old and sitting in the staff break room of the hotel, where she worked, doing his homework on a folding table, while she finished her shift, watching guests in nice clothes walk past the doorway, without so much as a glance, as if the usual people who made their beds and cleaned their bathrooms simply did not exist as human beings with names and children and dreams. He remembered, too, the manager of that hotel, a man named Harold Whitfield, who called Daniel's mother girl, though she was 43 years old, who docked her pay for a stain she hadn't made, who once told her in front of Daniel that people like her should be grateful for any job at all. Daniel was 9 years old when he decided, sitting on that folding chair with his math homework, blurring through tears he refused to let fall, that one day he would own hotels, and that no one who worked in them or stayed in them would ever be treated the way his mother had been treated by a true man who mistook a uniform for a measure of worth. The road there was not straight, and it was not kind. His mother died when he was 19. Of an illness that better healthcare might have caught earlier if she'd ever been able to afford to see a doctor for anything less than an emergency. He worked as a valet, then a bellhop, then a front desk clerk himself for nearly a decade, learning every single job in a hotel from the inside, remembering every guest who treated him like furniture and every guest who looked him in the eye and asked his name. He met his wife Sarah while she was a guest at a small inn where he worked the overnight desk, and she was the first person in years who asked him what he wanted his life to look like, rather than what he did for a living. They married young and poor and happy. Mia was born 3 years later, a tiny, furious, red-faced miracle that made Daniel weep in a hospital hallway the way he had not wept since his mother's funeral. The Meridian Grand and the 11 hotels that followed it existed because Daniel Brooks spent a decade building a business plan on nights he couldn't sleep, because Sarah believed in him, when investors laughed him out of rooms for not having a business degree, and because when the first hotel finally opened its doors, Daniel wrote one rule into the company's foundation above every other rule, a rule every employee signed as a condition of employment. Every person who walks through these doors, whether they arrive in a limousine or on foot, whether they are dressed for a gala or dressed for a long flight with a tired child, will be treated with the same dignity as the president of the company himself, because you will never know, simply by looking, who someone truly is. He remembered sitting across from Sarah at a chipped kitchen table in their first apartment, spreadsheets spread out between 2 mugs of coffee gone cold, the two of them arguing gently, lovingly, about whether the rule about dignity should be a suggestion or a signed condition of due employment. Sarah had been the one to insist on the latter. If it's just a suggestion, she told him, people will follow it right up until it's inconvenient. If it's a condition, it means something. She was right about almost everything in those early years. Right about the location of the first hotel, when 3 investors told him it would fail. Right feared. About hiring a general manager who had no hospitality degree, but had once given up her seat on an overbooked flight so an elderly stranger could get home to a dying relative. Right about the color of the lobby walls, when Daniel wanted beige and she wanted a deep, warm teal, that made guests feel, in her words, like they'd been invited somewhere, not processed somewhere. Every hallway in every Meridian Grand still carried a version of that teal, though almost no employee who worked there now knew why, or that the woman who chose it had never lived to see more than the first 2 hotels finished. 2 years after the Meridian Grand opened, Sarah was diagnosed with an aggressive cancer that took her in 11 months, and Daniel found stayed himself, a single father to a 4-year-old girl, while running a growing company. And he did both things the only way he knew how, with a kind of quiet, unglamorous stubbornness that refused to let either his daughter or his employees down. He stopped doing press. He stopped attending galas, where his photo might end up circulating. He built a private life around Mia, dropped her at kindergarten himself when he could, coached her soccer team badly and enthusiastically, and traveled to his properties unannounced and dressed like anyone else, because he wanted to see, with his own eyes and without ceremony, whether the rule he'd rest, written into the company's foundation, was actually being lived out by the people wearing the Meridian Grand name tag, or whether, like Harold Whitfield decades earlier, some of them had started mistaking a uniform, a car, or a hoodie for a measure of a person's worth. Sitting in that lobby chair at midnight with his daughter asleep against his shoulder, Daniel opened an internal app on his phone, one that only a handful of senior directors even knew existed, and typed a short message to the hotel's regional director, a woman named Priya Anand who had worked with him since the second hotel opened and who trusted him completely, even at midnight, even with no explanation beyond 4 words. Meridian Grand. Now, quiet. 14 minutes later, the elevator doors opened, and a woman in a rumpled blazer she'd clearly thrown on over pajamas walked briskly across the lobby, and Tyler and Denise both straightened at the front desk, recognizing her instantly as their actual general manager, a woman named Carla Reyes, who had been asleep in the staff apartments 2 floors up. Priya arrived 4 minutes after that, having been in a hotel 3 blocks away for an unrelated inspection, and the 2 of them crossed the lobby together, toward the man in the gray hoodie, holding a sleeping child. And what Tyler and Denise watched unfold next was the kind of moment that either builds a person's character permanently or breaks it, depending entirely on what they choose to do with the shame flooding into their faces. Carla reached Daniel first, and her voice cracked slightly as she said his name. Not the alias on the reservation, but his real name, Mr. Four. Brooks, I am so sorry. I don't understand what happened. Please, let me... And Daniel simply held up a hand, gently, the way a tired father does when he is choosing patience over confrontation, and said, Carla, I'm not upset with you. You were asleep. I want you to hear what happened, and then I want you to help me understand why it happened. Because I need to know if this is one bad night, or if this is something deeper in how we turf. The here training people. Priya, standing beside her, was already quietly reviewing the front desk log on her tablet, her expression unreadable. The expression of someone who had seen this company grow from 1 struggling hotel to 12 thriving ones, and took its founding rule as personally as Daniel Pless did. Denise, to her credit in that terrible moment, did not try to lie. She stammered an apology that fell apart halfway through a sentence about policy and verification. But Tyler, younger and more frightened, tried to explain that the man just looked like he was trying to scam a free upgrade, a sentence that hung in the lobby air like smoke, because it revealed exactly what Daniel had suspected the moment Denise asked to see what he could actually afford. They had not simply made a paperwork mistake. They had looked at a tired man in a hoodie holding his daughter's hand at midnight and decided, based on nothing but his clothes and his exhaustion, that he did not deserve their basic respect. And they had let that decision guide every choice they made for the next 15 minutes, including waking a child at midnight to feel unwelcome in a place that, unbeknownst to her, her own father had built. Carla did not need Daniel to tell her what to do next, though he stood beside her while she did it, because he believed people should see the consequences of how they treat others, not have those consequences handled invisibly behind closed office doors. She informed Tyler and Denise, calmly and without cruelty, but without hesitation, that their employment with the Meridian Grand was terminated effective immediately, that their badges and access would be deactivated before the shift change, and that human resources would follow up regarding their final pay in accordance with company policy. Denise began to cry, not performatively, but the raw, frightened crying of someone realizing, in real time, the size of what 30 seconds of assumption had cost her. Tyler's face went through disbelief. then anger, then something smaller and more honest, as he asked, almost pleading, whether there was any chance to make it right. Daniel, still holding his daughter, who had woken partway through the commotion and was watching with wide, confused eyes, looked at Tyler for a long moment before answering. "The room you offered me is not the problem," he said. "I own more rooms than either of you will likely ever sleep in. And none of that matters at midnight, when you're exhausted and holding a scared kid. The problem is that somewhere in the last few minutes, you decided a stranger's worth could be measured by his sneakers, and you let that decision guide how you treated a child. That's not a training problem. That's a character problem. And this company can teach you policy, but it can't teach you to see people. I hope you learn that somewhere else, because you're not going to learn it here." It would have been easy for the story to end there, with 2 firings and a father vindicated. And if this were only a story about justice, that might have been enough. But Daniel Brooks had not built 12 hotels and buried a wife and raised a daughter alone by settling for the easy ending. And what he did over the following weeks became, quietly, the more important part of this story. The part that spread through every property he owned and eventually reached far beyond it. He didn't fire the entire front desk staff. He didn't issue a public statement or hold a press conference, because that was never who he was. Instead, he asked Priya to pull the employment files of every front desk employee across all 12 hotels who had been with the company under 2 years. And he personally reviewed the training materials they'd been given. And what he found troubled him more than the incident itself. The founding rule about dignity was still printed on page 1 of the employee handbook, still recited in orientation. But somewhere over a decade of growth, hiring managers under pressure to fill shifts fast had stopped screening for the thing that mattered most, which wasn't experience or a polished resume, but the simple, teachable, unteachable quality of actually caring whether a stranger felt human. So Daniel did something that made news, not because a reporter caught wind of a scandal, but because a hotel employee at a different property, 3 states away, posted about it without knowing the full story behind it. Daniel began showing up, unannounced, dressed exactly as he had that rainy midnight, at every one of his 12 hotels. Sometimes with Mia, sometimes alone, checking in not as a test to catch people failing, but as a promise to himself that he would keep looking his own employees in the eye, at their most ordinary, unguarded moments, the way his mother had never once been looked at by the people she served for 22 years. He started a program, partly funded from his own pocket, rather than the company's marketing budget, that gave every WES and front desk employee an annual bonus tied not to guest survey scores about efficiency, but to a single anonymous question asked of guests at checkout. Did you feel treated with dignity, regardless of how you arrived? He renamed the program after his mother, Loretta, and had a small brass plaque installed behind every front desk in the company, not with his own name on it, but with hers, and a single sentence: "You never know who is standing in front of you. Treat them as if they matter, because they do." One of the first stories to come out of the Loretta program was about a housekeeper named Rosa Delgado, who had worked at the Meridian Grand's downtown location for 6 years, quietly, without much notice from management, folding towels into swans and leaving small paper notes of encouragement for guests she suspected were traveling through hard times, a habit she'd developed on her own, unasked, because she remembered what it felt like to check into cheap motels with her own children after leaving an unsafe marriage years earlier. When Daniel heard about her, not through a formal report, but through an offhand comment from a guest during one of his unannounced visits, he sought her out personally, sat with her in the same kind of break room he'd once done homework in as a boy, and asked her to help redesign the company's entire onboarding training, because she understood something about hospitality that no manual had ever managed to teach. Rosa now trains new hires at 3 properties and tells every class the same thing on their first day. This job will ask you to make 100 beds a week. Anyone can learn to make a bed. What you really here to do is make 100 people a week feel like somebody noticed them exist. That part, nobody can train into you if you don't already have it in your heart. So if you don't feel it, this probably isn't the right job for you. And that's all right too. Priya, for her part, restructured the hiring process across all 12 properties so that every candidate for a guest-facing role, regardless of experience, went through a simple, unscored conversation about a time they had been treated unfairly by someone with more power than them, and a time they had chosen to treat someone else with more kindness than that person expected. It wasn't a perfect filter, and Daniel never pretended it caught every bad decision before it happened. But it changed. measurably, the culture of who walked through the employee entrance each morning. And within 18 months, guest complaints related to discourteous treatment had dropped by nearly 2/3 across the company. A statistic Daniel cared about far less than the individual letters and emails that began arriving from guests describing small, specific moments of being seen. A night clerk who noticed a traveler's Forda's wedding ring was missing and quietly asked if they were all right, rather than assuming nothing. A valet who recognized a guest's old, battered car and treated it with the same care as the luxury sedans parked beside it. A breakfast attendant who remembered a child's food allergy 3 visits in a row without being asked twice. Mia, who was 6 years old on the night her father was denied a room in his own hotel, grew up hearing this story not as a tale of revenge, but as her father's favorite bedtime lesson, retold so many times over the following years that she could recite it herself by the time she'd turned 10, ending it always with the same line her father used to close it. The measure of this family was never going to be how many hotels we owned. It was always going to be how we treated the person mopping the floor of the smallest one. Denise, the assistant manager who broke down in that lobby, wrote Daniel a letter 8 months later, unprompted, describing a volunteer position she'd taken at a shelter, and a slow, painful unlearning of assumptions she hadn't realized she'd been carrying since childhood. And Daniel wrote back, briefly, that he wished her well and hoped she carried the lesson forward, not because he owed her forgiveness, but because he believed, as his mother had somehow still believed after 22 years of being called girl by men who thought a uniform made her small, that most people are capable of becoming better than their worst 30 seconds, if someone bothers to show them what better looks like. Years later, when Daniel Brooks was finally profiled, reluctantly, in a business magazine that wanted to understand how a company with almost no advertising budget had built one of the most beloved hospitality brands in the country, the reporter asked him what he considered the single most important decision he'd ever made as a founder. He didn't mention a financing round or a real estate deal or an expansion strategy. He talked instead about a rainy midnight, a sleeping child on his shoulder, and 2 young employees who had looked at a tired father in a hoodie and decided he didn't matter, and how that night had taught him that the true test of any company, any person, any family, is not how they treat the people who can help them, but how they treat the people they believe can't. My mother spent 22 years being invisible to people who thought a uniform made her less than them, he said. I didn't build 12 hotels to prove I was better than the people who ignored her. I built them to make sure nobody who works in mine, or stays in mine, ever has to feel invisible again. That's not a business strategy. That's just the only kind of legacy that ever mattered to me. The reporter, taking notes, asked one final question, almost as an afterthought, whether Daniel ever worried that telling this story publicly, even years later, might embarrass the 2 employees who had been let go that night. Daniel was quiet for a moment before answering. He said he thought about it often, and that he had decided, deliberately, never to use their names in interviews, never to let the story become about punishing 2 young people for a mistake made at the exhausted end of a long shift, because he remembered too well what it felt like to be young and underpaid and unseen himself, and he did not believe permanent shame was ever the point. The point, he said, was the brass plaque behind every front desk, and the training Rosa now led, and the fact that somewhere across 12 hotels, on any given night, a tired stranger, who didn't look like much on the surface, was being handed a room key by someone who had learned, the hard way or the easy way, that dignity was never supposed to be conditional in the first place. Mia, who is older now, sometimes tells the story herself. At company town halls, her father still to Nick insists on holding in hotel ballrooms rather than corporate offices, and she always ends it the same way her father taught her, standing at a podium far too tall for her the first time she tried it, her voice steady in a way that would have made her mother proud. The measure of this family was never going to be how many hotels we owned. It was always going to be how we treated the person mopping the floor of the smallest one. If this story reminded you that kindness costs nothing and judgment can cost everything, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the next time you meet a stranger who doesn't look like much on the surface, that you never really know who is standing in front of you.